So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Benjamin Sovacool, who is the perfect person to teach us all how to go from a half-baked idea to an executed study that has real-world impact. Benjamin, as you know, is director of the Institute for Global Sustainability here at BU and a professor of Earth and Environment. And he's been here for a relatively short time, actually a really short time, but has already had an outsized impact on BU scholarship and administration through his leadership at the Institute and through other activities. And his research record is quite jaw-dropping. He came to BU from Sussex, and he has had just a litany of awards and grants, counting more than $28 million in grants from MacArthur and from Rockefeller, European Research Council, and a range of US organizations. And likewise, his article count is quite stunning. He has more than 50,000 cites of his work. His H-index is 113. And if you know anything about H-indexes, which is a snapshot of how much you've been cited, 40 is considered, quote, outstanding, and 60 is considered, quote, totally exceptional, truly exceptional. So his record of scholarship, impact, and leadership is just really superb. So he's going to help us get to that stage someday. So I'll toss the floor over to Benjamin, who will give the talk, and then we'll break for Q&A. And if at any point you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And then Deanna Hughes, our administrator, who helps to run all things at the Center for Innovation and Social Science, will help to present those questions with me to Professor Sovacool. So thank you for attending today, and the floor is now Benjamin's.
Thank you very much, Debbie. And you know that out of those 50,000 citations, if you remove self-citations, there's still 1,000 left. So that's a joke for those of you that know about citations. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here, and a bit of a weird talk because it's kind of like giving you tips and secrets about how to succeed as a professional researcher at a time where it's not easy to succeed as a professional researcher. So I've titled my talk today, From Half-Baked Idea to Publication, Launching and Structuring Academic Research Papers. And I've broken it down into these 5 beautiful areas, which will take me about an hour to get through. So I want to start and dazzle you with some amazing statistics. I want to go to the basics about how to articulate research questions, because I'm also an editor, which Debbie maybe doesn't even know. I've processed about 10,000 articles as an editor-in-chief. And I would say that more than half of them have bad research questions, which means they're not publishable from the start. And I'll talk to you in a bit about why and how you can make much more effective research questions. Then I'll talk to you about how we do research design, broken into novelty, rigor, and style. Then I'm going to switch gears entirely and talk about promotion of your work, which is something that I was never even trained to do. We just had to kind of learn it. Learning is doing, I think, is what we call that. And finally, I will end with 5 tips that you can take today, tonight, tomorrow, the rest of the week to become a better and more productive researcher immediately if you choose to. So let's get started. Elsevier, which is the world's top publisher, and I don't mean top in terms of best, I mean top by volume. They have the largest number of articles and journals and books. Other really big publishers are Springer Nature or Sage or Wiley, but Elsevier, which is the biggest, gets 1.3 million articles a year. About 365 of these are accepted, and it adds to a corpus of almost 70 million academic articles that are available on Scopus. And again, this is just Scopus. There are other databases like the Web of Science or Google Scholar. These are downloaded 700 million times from 11 million researchers in more than 100 countries. So this is already starting to sketch who your peers are. When you publish, you're in a race against these 11 million other expert researchers, all racing to publish many times in the same journals. And rejections rates vary, 30% at some, quote, easy journals, up to 99% for your journals like Nature and Science. But I really want to focus on this average of 82%. So across all journals, 82% of articles are rejected. This is amazing. 4 out of 5 don't make it. And this is not numbers for just students or just numbers for the global South. This is for everyone. Nobel laureates, laboratory directors, distinguished professors, all of us are facing rejection a lot of the time. This isn't just people that are learning to get their PhD or some struggling postdoc in the 14th month of their first job. So this really underscores how difficult it is to get published, as well as how poorly a lot of submissions are, whether they, as you can see here in the left part of the diagram, heading into the trash can, they are badly written, they have no research design, they don't generalize, they aren't really original, and their conclusions aren't supported by their data analysis, which is very different from studies that are very well written and structured, have amazing methods, deep engagement with the journal, and make a groundbreaking contribution to the literature. And I think that as much as most scholars think it's a curse that we have to fight to be published so much, it's also a bit of a blessing because it does make excellence easy to spot. My own rule as an editor is 20% of what I see is in this garbage can. There are typos in the abstract, the title doesn't make sense, doesn't meet aims and scope, so I reject them in about 1 minute. There are 10% of articles that I see, I get excited. I may yelp, I may make exclamations, I may pound the desk, I may jump, and then I want these articles at my journal. I'm rooting for them. I think, wow, what a great idea, wish I thought of that. However, this other 70% is kind of in the middle. It's kind of meh. I don't really know if it makes a contribution. I don't really know if it's any good or not. And I may or may not reject it, or I may or may not assign it to my associate editor. So today's talk will equip you with the tools to get out of the bottom 20%. And if you really work hard, it can enable you to move from that 70% of May articles into that 10% of outstanding excellent articles. So how do we do this? 3 scholars, myself, John, and Steve. Now I realize we don't have the most diversity in terms of gender or skin color, but we are very, very diverse in methods. John is a modeler and econometrician. Steve Sorrell is a quantitative data analysis, and I'm more of a qualitative researcher. And we really wanted to, in some of our work, bring attention to how to structure studies, provide a framework for what novelty is, because most of the time, if you're getting your PhD, we say we want a novel contribution to knowledge. And journals will say, what is your novelty? What is special about the contribution that you're trying to make? I will talk to you about rigor, and I will finally talk to you about style and how to write well. So I think we begin, as I hinted, with research questions. Most really strong articles from the beginning have a socially relevant, interesting, and also answerable or falsifiable research question. All 3 need to be important. And this puts that research into a typology in the upper right that has been called Pasteur's quadrant of research that both has a social good, it meets a practical problem, it can be used by the commercial sector or by stakeholders, but also a scientific contribution. Pasteur did this because not only did we get a better understanding of microbes and pathogens from his work, we also created pasteurization, which was a technique of preserving food, which had very positive effects on malnutrition and on alleviating hunger. It's very hard for research to make that dual contribution. Many times it could be purely applied or purely theoretical. And you obviously want to avoid the bottom left quadrant of research that's so poor because it's biased or it's badly designed that it makes no contribution at all. Now, I actually spend a whole class when I teach methods going on research questions. And it's arguably the most important part of your research, which is why I'm dwelling on it so much here. You could even say it's half of the work of putting a thesis or dissertation together, because it guides your literature review. It frames the answers you can give. It informs where you're going to kind of look for your data. And it's also a device that disciplines you as you go off and collect data to return to and focus on the question. Don't go down too many rabbit holes. Don't have too many deviations or lack of focus. It's also a misconception that most people get their research question right the first time. It's a recursive, iterative process. Usually you'll have a question, read, change it, collect data, change it a bit more. So there are many people who are actually changing their research question even on the last draft, because it's a process that works together. It co-evolves with your data. So, and that's okay. And you have to learn to kind of live with that. Many research questions that are good are puzzles. Puzzles are kind of observations that don't really have an explanation, or they're that at odds with conventional understanding of the world. You can configure your research questions to address various types of gaps too, whether it's an evidence gap or a methodological gap or an empirical gap, or even gaps in, say, sampling or population. So when you think about it systematically, it isn't so hard to find gaps that research questions can help address. I tell my students, yes, I know this is too many, but I still tell my students that their research questions should be guided by 10 principles. 10. All of them are necessary. As I said, you need to have a real world problem you're going to address. There are plenty of those: poverty, racism, species loss, climate change, war at the moment. However, you have to make them empirical. You want to make sure these questions don't float by themselves, but they're actually connected with evidence, with literature, with previous preliminary material. This is where you can often look for your puzzles. You want to make sure they're also novel. They advance our understanding of a key debate, or they help solve a puzzle, or they show something has been ignored in earlier research, hence the gaps before. You want to also make sure it stands as its own question by itself, which is also a problem. I see lots of research questions that are like 6 questions in one. What are the benefits, barriers, and future markets of mobile phones? That's 3 questions, not 1 question. Can you answer the question? Do you know that you've been answered? Could there be other answers? Is it stated in such a way that Karl Popper would say that it can be proven or disproven? Is it fairly simple? Would it pass if you were talking to your grandmother or grandfather on the phone, that test? Or if you were at a cocktail party with President Biden, would you be able to tell him in 10 seconds or 20 seconds what your question is? This is also a key one. Can you actually research it? There are many, many questions, what's the meaning of life, that you can't really answer with data. They're too subjective, or they're too normative, or there are those that you can't get the data, right? And so you also want to make sure that the question that you have is one that you can actually research, especially given your resources, your current political climate, and your current access to various online resources. I tell my students to have factual questions rather than counterfactual questions. I tell my students to also make sure that there's parsimony and that your questions don't involve too many factors. So your question becomes about everything, like electricity market reform can be about technology or pricing or markets or users or finance. So it's probably too many. You need a more specific question that delves into electricity reform, which gets me to my final one, which is you also want to make sure your questions are very narrow. So you'll find it's a bit hard. Takes practice. Follow these tips. You get a relevant, empirical, novel, concrete, falsifiable, answerable, simple, researchable, factual, parsimonious, and narrow research question. You've done a really good job. And I'll give you just 3 examples that meet many of those criteria. Probably not all, but many of them. So here's a bad research question. Does socioeconomic development require the prior democratic consolidation of the extant political arrangements? This is tough to read. It comes from a neo-Marxist treatise. It's not a really good question. I think what they meant to say is, does democracy make nations wealthier? That is a good question, but it's not a very researchable question. And it's also very hard to answer and falsify that question. Plus, what type of democracy? What type of nations? What type of wealth? So a far, far better one is, well, democratic reforms founded for a particular country over a particular amount of time. So you can already see heading from a maybe obtuse, unanswerable question to a much better, more concrete question. Here's the second one. Is protectionism dead in the 21st century? I don't know what dead means. How about this? Have protectionist measures fallen out of favor among major agricultural exporters of the past century? Getting in the right direction, right? Because You've bounded it in time a bit, and you're now starting to narrow it to say major agricultural exporters, although you don't tell us which ones. Far better. You've picked your 3 countries. Have Brazil, Russia, and South Africa utilize protectionism to safeguard their farming sectors in the past 30 years. This change from 100 to 30 years also makes it a lot more researchable and a lot more answerable and a lot more narrow. Finally, does Singapore practice the precautionary principle? It's a bad question because, well, what do we really mean by precautionary principle and what forms of practice? Slightly better would be, is it enshrined in their medical law? But again, which medical laws, what time frame? So far better would be, what about their medical waste policy? Is that, and what about their current policy? So then you shift it again to make it very specific and answerable in time and place. And these are just 3 examples, but you kind of get the idea for how to move from obtuse, vague, bad questions to precise, answerable, and narrow questions. Once you have your research question, though, you have to then execute a research design. This means you have to set your aims and objectives, and then you have to explicate a research design, which is how your methods work in concert to achieve your objectives, and then answer that research question. And in my own field of energy and climate social science, there are 7 core research designs. There are experiments and quasi-experiments, literature reviews, surveys, data analysis, energy modeling, qualitative research, which is my own specialty, and case studies. Now, you can also have hybrid research structures. You could say case studies of qualitative research, or experiments that then use data analysis and statistics. But for the most part, these 7 research designs do stand on their own. You can all see they have very different disciplinary backgrounds. You can see they have different kind of gold standards. It's randomized controlled trials for experiments. It's systematic reviews for lit reviews. It's mixed methods, qualitative research for qualitative research. It's probably a high-level comparative case analysis for case studies. And they have very different research cultures. And sadly for you, very different codes of practice for what rigor is. And in many disciplines, it's a contest. No one really knows. There is too much divergence over what rigor and validity are, which is why we see such high rejection rates, because different dogmatic scholars apply different criteria in different domains. That means you have to couple a research design to novelty. What is your novel contribution to the field or the literature, to society? And what John Axon and Steve Sorrell and I did in that article that I mentioned is we have a framework that says, well, you can actually have 3 different types of novelty. It's not just one type, there's 3. The type that is most known is here, and that is theoretical novelty. Theoretical novelty can be, if you're really, really, really good, inventing your own theory. I've done this a few times, not too much celebration or success. The 2 examples I have here are much more successful. Colleagues of mine who got tired of looking at linear notions of innovation invented technological innovation systems, which talks about 7 functions of innovation and how innovations co-evolve with technologies and agents and policies. Similarly, Elizabeth Shove, Harriet Bulkley, and colleagues invented social practice theory, which says if you want to understand why people use energy services, don't focus on the technology, focus on things like comfort and cleanliness and convenience and practices of eating, bathing, showering, and sleeping, which shape energy choices. There's a good examples of where we needed a new concept that helped advance the field towards different directions. But that's very hard to do. And for every 1 new concept that is successful, there are probably 99 that fail. So I don't suggest that most of you create your own theories. Even us full professors have difficulty creating new theories. What you could do is synthesize or reformulate existing theories. The good example I have here is called UTAUT. It's the Unified Theory of the Adoption and Use of Technology. It took 8 other theories Asgen's theory of planned behavior, the theory of reasoned action, Schwartz's norm activation model, Rogers' diffusion of innovations, and others, and put them into one meta theory. And that meta theory is quite good at having predictive power, at explaining why people adopt new technology. And it's very highly cited as well. So there's a good example of the innovation of Utah. It wasn't to create, it was to synthesize. And finally, my own favorite is to test theory, triangulate theory. So this could be where you have one research question and you say, well, which theory best answers this question? And this is a great idea that goes back to the 60s when Graham Allison took the Cuban Missile Crisis and tested it with 3 different political science theories: constructivism, realism, and liberalism, and found that each of those 3 theories explained the crisis well. And I think this is a great way of advancing our understanding because it shows that multiple theories reveal multiple things about a phenomenon. And only with multiple perspectives can you get more parallax and a much better intuitive grasp on a single problem or question. So I think theoretical triangulation is pretty neat. And I'd say still 99% of studies that I see use one theory. They don't test 3 or 2 or more. But conceptual and theoretical novelty is not the only novelty. And this is where even I'm still fighting with editors who want conceptual advancement. Well, that's not all that scholars do, and not all of us are good at it. We don't necessarily need more theory. So I really believe a second form of novelty, which is just as valid as the first, is methodological novelty. What is this? Well, this could be mixing methods in a certain way or sequencing methods in a multi-method study. Narratives lead to modeling, lead to focus group validation, right? Which give you far more triangulation or explanatory power than a one method at one point in time. Similarly, if you're running models, making them more behaviorally realistic to account for information asymmetries and satisficing decisions and time lags and opportunity costs, which will have far greater accuracy like agent-based models at predicting future decisions. Or finally, longitudinal research. One of the flaws with my research, even my mixed methods research, is I often do it at only one point in time. I interview in January and I have focus group in February, and maybe I collect data from diaries in March, and then I write my paper. But there's a lot to be said for repeated data collection from panels or going back to your respondents to get a far better picture over time. And the good example here is Ben Anderson has a fantastic study on laundry use. If you want to understand laundry use in the UK, I mean, 20 years from millions of observations from household diaries, it's a very good longitudinal study that has a very high degree of power in its explanations because it was so methodologically rigorous. However, methodological novelty isn't the only type of novelty apart. With conceptual novelty, you have a third, which is my personal favorite, which is empirical novelty. This could be taking existing theories, don't tweak them or synthesize them or triangulate them, and just applying them to new regions. And a really good example here is Michael Horowitz took the diffusion of innovations theory, which was used for stuff like washing machines and automobiles, and he applied it to suicide terrorism as an innovation. That was very, very novel because he thought about terrorism as a form of innovation that had early adopters and late adopters and a late majority and an early majority that took it up. So there's a good example of taking a new theory and applying it in a novel way. Could also be getting data from hard to reach groups, children, the elderly, indigenous communities, the survivors of Fukushima or Deepwater Horizon. Or finally, new forms of evidence that are very empirical, like using big data, machine learning, topic modeling, telematics, or here at BU, we have a phenomenal remote sensing department. And you can see here in the bottom right, people have used remote sensing to do things like estimate terrorist production from oil production from terrorist cells, and argue that in fact the threat has been inflated by security actors at the CIA, and that in reality there's probably far less oil production than we thought. So there's a socially relevant problem that was answered with a new form of empirical data. So novelty, we often say, apart from having a good research question, is one of 3 core ingredients to a good paper. But there is a second, and that's rigor. And rigor is the definition of being thorough or careful or having a very high degree of internal and external validity. In some disciplines, there is literally a hierarchy of validity, a chain of evidence. This is from the experimental research design. So this is for like life sciences and psychology, where you move up the ladder towards greater levels of understanding. It's one thing to have one person say that they smoked a cigarette and they coughed, or to then say you had 10 people in a room on a committee and they all said, one time I smoked a cigarette and I coughed. You move all the way up to a review of 85 countries, 25 million people over 30 years that found 85% of people who smoke develop emphysema that then causes coughing. So you can see already there's some truth there that meta-analysis and systematic review is far stronger evidence than the earlier pilot experiments or peer review did. For a lot of these disciplines, validity is literally moving up the ladder. It is that simple. And I've even seen peer review checklists that have the ladder and they're kind of ticking the box to see if you move up or not. I've seen such hierarchies also proposed and utilized explicitly or implicitly for reviews, right? A narrative review with a convenient sample is not as good as a systematic review, which is not as good as a fully weighted meta-analysis, or for data analysis. I have colleagues, especially my econometricians, who only will accept articles that are multivariate longitudinal analysis these days. Anything that's not for them, because it's the gold standard, is rejected. Forget bivariate analysis or analysis of variance or difference in difference. They want multivariate longitudinal analysis or forget it. Same with case studies. 2 cases is better than 1, right? More generalizability, more comparability. 10 is better than 2, 50 is better than 10, 300 is better than 50. Right? So the kind of more cases you add within reason, the stronger the review would be. And I think as much as I like the idea of these hierarchies, you do have some problems. First, if no one does the pilot studies and the single controlled experiments, how can someone else do the systematic review? Someone has to do the lower rungs on the ladder so someone else can do the higher analysis. And in fact, you do see lots of research teams that sweep in and only do reviews. So they're kind of predators circling above all of the evidence, waiting for trials and experiments to be published, and then they get all the credit for doing a nice review at the end. You often have to balance different criteria when you think about whether you really want to pursue different rungs on the hierarchy, especially if you're mixing methods. If you mix 3 methods, then you need to have up on the hierarchy for all 3. That's probably impossible and extremely expensive. And it also differs greatly in disciplines. You could take something at the top of the hierarchy for life sciences and submit it to a discourse journal, Theory, Culture, and Society, and they'll reject it. Or you take a beautifully done discourse analysis drawing from Foucault, and you send it to the British Medical Journal, and of course they'll reject it as well. So you've still done well on the hierarchies of validity for that field, but you've submitted to a different field with different hierarchies of validity. And I like this. This is a term in England, courses for courses. Choose the right course or the right horse to kind of run in a particular way on the right course. It's also called fit for purpose. So I always tell my students, don't choose higher levels on the hierarchy of validity if you don't have the time. Systematic review takes about a year. So it's probably not a good idea if you got to finish your PhD in 9 months, or funding. Randomized controlled trial takes about $5 million. So if you only have $50,000 in your budget for your PhD stipend, don't do it. Or accessing the data. Your beautiful study of Chernobyl cancer survivors may run into huge problems with getting access to the actual respondents who could help fill in questionnaires and surveys, or getting institutional review board approval. So don't always choose higher up if you don't really think you've got the skills, competency, or resources to execute them. And there's often marginal value to moving up, right? A comprehensive review that takes you 3 months might be almost as good as a systematic review, but take you far, far less time. Finally, moving to something I have very little of, what is style? How do you write well? This is the 3rd ingredient after novelty and rigor to a good research product. Gosh, this font is large. I've put titles and abstracts here because these are the 2 most important parts of a research paper. It's what the editor reads first. It's what the peer reviewers read first. It's what the readers read first. And yet most people only think about titles and abstracts as an afterthought. These two things should be perfect. You should put more thought into them than any other part of the manuscript. You should also have a well thought out macro structure that is usually achieved with a high level outline from the start, which is what I used to do. All of my earlier papers would begin with a 1-page outline, that became a 2-page outline, that became a 10-page outline, but they started small and very, very concretely structured. There are many, many different types of structure, and I won't dwell on these, but just know that you don't have to follow the INRAD approach to articles. That's introduction, methods, results, and discussion. You could have a chronological structure, a conceptual structure, a cross-disciplinary structure, a hypotesting structure, a spatial structure, a technology structure, a thematic structure, a narrative structure, or even a hybrid structure. So there are all sorts of ways that you can structure your results, but I would pick one and execute it. The worst is someone who blends it all together, and this part of the manuscript is on concepts, and this is on space, and this is on themes, and this is a narrative. That doesn't work very well. Part of style is also writing well. This is called microstructure. So making sure that you are paying attention to your paragraphs and your voice, active writing and passive writing, making sure you're accurate in your referencing, making sure that you're aiming for short rather than long, making sure that you minimize jargon and acronyms. And I am a big fan of also using visual display items like photographs and diagrams and figures and charts. Just to give you a few quick examples, I could talk to you about energy poverty in India, or I could literally show you the 11-year-old coal miner near Chandigarh who spends 12 hours in a coal mine to provide money for his family. I could talk about the hazards of mining cobalt and copper in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or I could show you a miner going into a pit without any protective gear, ventilation, structural support. He doesn't even have a shovel, a ladder, or shoes in the photograph. I could talk to you about how the Deepwater Horizon spill had $30 billion of damages to the Gulf of Mexico, or I could show you from space a NASA satellite picture of just how much the plume of oil spread into the Gulf of Mexico. You can also use very clever devices like tables, because I'm going to tell you something that Debbie and I know, but it's a little known secret. People don't read the full article. They usually skim and jump, especially students. They'll read the abstract and the introduction and the conclusion and maybe skim the rest. So good authors make it easy for them, knowing full well you'll put devices in the paper like tables and diagrams that help the reader who's lazy. Whether it is a previewing table, so this table is totally gratuitous. We didn't need it. We put it in because we thought in the introduction, it's kind of complicated. This particular article was a survey of 11 countries. We had 8 different propositions, initially called hypotheses, but the peer reviewers wanted them to be called propositions. And it got a bit confusing. So we were like, look, here's what we're doing. We're testing these propositions, which we describe in this way, which link to our survey in this way. So it's just there to make it simple for the readers, even though all of this detail is in the manuscript itself later on. Or here, in this article, we did dual lit reviews, a lit review of the second academic literature and a lit review of the popular literature. And back then I was just a postdoc, so I couldn't read 983 popular articles. So I sampled randomly 1 out of 10, and that got us a final corpus of 52 articles. It's a little confusing, but to make it very, very simple, we made this diagram, as you can tell, 20 years ago, 12 years ago, which helps simplify the research design to make it very easy to understand. You can also illustrate. I could give you the statistics behind this, or you can literally see, drawn like an oil drum, the domestic energy reserves that the United States has in the contiguous 48 states. And I could tell you that wind, solar, and biomass and geothermal have a lot of energy, or you could see it here. And then it really makes you wonder, why are American energy makers so focused on extracting gas and uranium and coal and shale when they're not really tapping the core resource mix? And it's much more effective, I think, as a visual diagram. And you can also document. We were looking at interconnection standards and opposition to solar energy, and managed to find documents from different systems operators about how oppressive they were at forcing people who wanted to build solar energy to pay ridiculous fees and interconnection costs and sponsor indemnity studies and all sorts of other nonsense. Finally, you can simplify. This diagram I like, Marilyn gets credit for it, Marilyn Brown. It used to be 12 separate figures that we condensed into one figure to help simplify visually a fairly complex study, which created an energy security scorecard for the US. Everything in italics got better. That's energy efficiency and sulfur dioxide emissions. Everything else got worse. And you can see that fairly simplistically in this dashboard. Final part of style is also very hard for academics and very hard for me, and that is being humble and transparent. It means erring on the side of transparency and being more descriptive of your methods and more disclosing of your assumptions, always trying to tell you more than maybe you think that they need about how you went about doing your research. It means proactively listing your limitations. We even now have a section in all of our articles, usually section 3.3, which is limitations. We spell them out for you ourselves. Sampling bias, maybe survivor bias, maybe limitations with our data analysis. Be respectful when you critique others. You could say that you think that Schmidt et al. Are morons, or you could say our work builds on Schmidt et al. You've said almost the same thing, except one is very polite and one is very antagonistic. And you never know when you're going to run into people that you potentially critique as you go about on conferences, or even as you're looking to get promoted to tenure or looking for jobs. That also means starting to ask for criticism, preempting criticism, having colleagues read your work and reading the work of your colleagues. And I like this. The Nobel laureate for literature 4 years ago said that for him, writing was a willingness to be terrible the first time around. And I like that. Allow yourself to be terrible with first drafts and second drafts. You'll find that once you get it on paper, it tends to be a lot easier to write and rewrite. And I've even been told by some of my more cantankerous colleagues that when I write, it's like people, I vomit words onto the page and they have to clean them up. I disagree with that, but at least I'm partially meeting this notion of allowing myself, I guess, to be terrible as I draft the first time around. I think taking time to write, taking time to practice works. And for me, I got into a daily writing habit where I write every day. I wrote today already before this meeting. I will write on airplanes and taxis, on buses. And I think, you know, I like this. This is from a colleague who kind of set up 7 tips for how they became a successful writer. I also have an idea capture system in the shower and things like that. I want to write down ideas. But I think, you know, set aside 1 or 2 hours a day if writing is important for you. And just like exercise or eating and sleeping, get it into your daily routine. So in the article with Steve and John, in the section on style, we have this table, which is quite long, and it's really useful, and it's like a checklist. It takes a prototypical good paper and a prototypical bad paper. And I will tell you, even though I've written, as Debbie said, a few hundred articles, I still catch myself doing some things in the bad papers because maybe it's a bad habit, maybe I was tired, or maybe I was rushed, or maybe it was a mistake. And so it even helps me, even though I wrote the table, go back and back at remembering to always aim for goodness rather than laziness or badness, whether it is in the topic, in the abstract, in the intro. My gosh, introductions that are too long, I see all the time, 4 paragraphs, 8 paragraphs, 10 paragraphs. Some of my best studies have 2-paragraph introductions. Just get to the point and go. When also your research questions and your results, are you interpreting data or letting it speak for itself? Is the data coupled with the analysis, or are they decoupled and messy and all over the place? To your discussion and conclusion, which are, if I see another 1-paragraph conclusion that is just repasted in abstract, I'm going to go nuts, right? The conclusion should do more. It should be the best part of the article, as well as kind of general structure tips here. So again, lots and lots of good fodder for you all to look at later. Moving then from basic mechanics, research question, novelty, rigor, style. What makes excellence? What gets you to that 10% of stuff that editors are like, hurrah, when they look at it? And I think there is an idea that, well, you can actually design research from the start to be excellent. And there is this kind of notion, my own notion, is that, well, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research is better than disciplinary. Mixed methods research is better than research with one method. Research that is falsifiable and confirmable is much better than research that isn't, or isn't transparent, or they didn't disclose their method, so you couldn't replicate it. Comparative cases or having a high degree of generalizability is better than not. Addressing a real-world practical problem is a must. Advancing and applying concepts, or at least engaging with them, is a must. What about all of them? Well, I suspect if you were able to craft an article that was interdisciplinary, mixed methods, falsifiable, comparative, practical, and conceptual, and it actually fit, that is heading towards that 10% of outstanding research. But it doesn't happen by accident. Many times, the intensity of data collection and how long it took you to do the paper is a proxy for robustness. So it was hard to do, and you did it well. Most of the time, editors and reviewers will acknowledge that, including primary data from hard to access places. So we had a study published in Energy Policy in Papua New Guinea that has a fairly low sample of interviews, I think 25. Actually, there's me in the middle in that photo in Papua New Guinea talking to a principal outside of Port Moresby doing an interview. But the reviewers understood that Papua New Guinea is hard to get to. We had to do 18 flights to get to the 4 different cities in Papua New Guinea, and then ride in a Jeep. I think we even got mugged at one of the stops. So they recognized that it was hard to get there. And so the study had a very easy time in peer review. If you do sophisticated modeling, like my colleague Lance here had access to University of Delaware's supercomputer and ran 86 million simulations, which had a very high degree of computational rigor, which also reviewers respected, and he was able to publish his perspective on the benefits of renewable energy and low carbon transport. There could be new methods too, like household diaries, that was Ben Anderson, or shadowing and stalking, or tools in sociology, where they're not stated preference techniques, but revealed preference techniques, where if you like, rather than interviewing a taxi driver, you ride in a taxi and shadow them. Rather than interview a restaurant owner, you sit in the restaurant and order food. So it's a more real world like form of research that avoids the Hawthorne effect. Anything else that takes a large amount of time, large scale meta-analysis, systematic reviews, large scale content analysis. I have a colleague, Lawrence Williams, who really wanted to understand shale gas debates in the UK. So he read political testimony. And by political testimony, you may mean what political testimony? I mean, he read all of it. Every form of political testimony over a 10-year period, every speech, press release, parliamentary briefing, or statement made in Parliament. He had to read 1,552 documents. And he did. He set himself up a coding budget. He would read 10 a day. It took him about 6 months. So that large scale content analysis meant that, again, reviewers tended to respect it, and we published the study in a top tier environmental studies journal called Global Environmental Change. Sometimes methodological novelty, like I said, is mixing methods. This shows you the merits of mixing qualitative and quantitative methods. These are all of the methods that I've used. So there are many, many more, including direct observation. That's actually my hands holding the dosimeter outside of reactor number 4 at Chernobyl, showing fairly unsafe levels of radiation, which we used in our research to argue that Chernobyl cleanup wasn't going as expected. But again, you could see coupling together literature reviews, document analysis, archives, surveys, participant observation, GIS, content analysis. You can mix them in very unique ways that also can create outstanding, excellent insights and research products. The final thing you can do is mimic those you admire. So if there are excellent researchers that you like, mimic them. This shows you 5 scholars who have had a very big effect on my life. This is David Harvey in the upper left. He is a political geographer. That's E.O. Wilson, the biologist, in the upper right. It's Thomas Kuhn in the bottom left. He wrote the book about paradigms. That's Amory Lovins, who's still alive and has done work on energy efficiency and renewables. And that's Eleanor Ostrom in the bottom right, who is the first Nobel laureate in economics who was a woman. They, all five of them, are amazing, brilliant writers. So many times when I'm writing, I'm kind of trying to channel my inner Ostrom, or my inner Kuhn, or my inner Wilson. That also means that you can find excellent research that is highly cited or really well regarded or has won awards, and read it, not for the substance, but for the style. Read it to see, well, how does it look? How do they do the title? And how do they do the abstract? And how do they design their diagrams? What do they reference? How do they structure the results? How do they frame it for the journal? And so you kind of backwards engineer what they did and also try to mimic excellent research, because it is excellent. And nothing breeds success like success. Final two things, I know I'm getting on in time, is promoting your research. So in the UK, where I came before, there was a thing called the Research Excellence Framework, which usually boils down impact to these two things. These is actually Debbie was introducing me. It was your citations and your H factor. Citations are number of scholars who referenced your work, and H factors number of papers published number of times. So if you have 10 papers published or 10 papers cited 10 times, your H factor is 10. If it's 50, you have 50 papers that are cited 50 times. But as much as I like these quantitative metrics, there are many other ways of knowing that you're having an impact, whether it is getting downloaded or being mentioned in court decisions or legal testimony, or in political or parliamentary or congressional debates, or being cited in the popular press, or getting personal requests for your research, or getting requests for consultancies, or getting interviewed by the media, Boston Globe, New York Times, or getting invited to conferences. All of these are a good sign of your impact. And many professors like myself and Debbie are getting multiple forms of these impact every week or month. And in rare cases, advertising. This is a one-off for me, but I was very chuffed to learn that one of my studies has been placed onto billboards in California. So we did a study about the health benefits of wind power, and Wind Power Works picked it up and ran an advertising campaign near San Francisco. The only thing I don't know is why this woman is here and what she has to do with it. And they didn't cite the study in the billboard, but they are our results. And at least it was kind of nice to know that we impacted a corporation and how they decided to talk about the benefits of wind. This also means that impact can take a lot of forms. Social media is another way that people are starting to track impact, and you can look this up later. There are two free services, Altmetric and PlumX, which literally take research products and track how they're doing on social media. They'll look at how much are they mentioned on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and blogs and in the general press. They'll give you a score. You could even break down into metrics and look at who's talking about your work and where and why, and how many times, and if they're saying good things or bad things. You can also distribute your research yourself. I used to travel to the World Renewable Energy Congresses back before we had PDFs, and I would have a suitcase with my clothes and a suitcase full of printed articles. And I would literally go to the conferences and pass them out as much as I could to colleagues. And it was nice. I mean, I did not leave any of those conferences with any articles left, nor did I see any in trash cans. You can create, and I do this, I have an email list of colleagues by both topical area, UK, US, Germany, or that's geographic, or topical, nuclear power, et cetera. So if I have a study on nuclear power in Germany, I'll send it to my nuclear power colleagues and my German colleagues. I don't do this a lot, only a few times a year, but it does help me disseminate my work. And I'm getting about 2 or 3 of these emails a day now from other colleagues who are emailing me their work. And I know of some top professors in the field who actually only rely on this kind of social networking to get evidence, because they're thinking if it's good enough, if it's a good study, someone will email it to me. They don't even bother to do lit reviews anymore. They only rely on email and who sends them their studies. You could also send them to different email lists, but that can be, don't abuse those. and make sure you always frame it for those lists. I'll talk about that in a moment. You could also have a professional or personal website. So here's my old website. I've never had a personal website. They're always institutional, and it's not bad. But my colleague Scott Valentine made his own website. Here it is, scottvalentine.net. And Scott says he gets about 300 or 400 visits a month. So not bad, a few hundred people coming to his website. Very friendly, dear friends. Here's a personal website so I can communicate with you and clients. Or you can go all out, like my colleague Johan Schott, who has a professional website and a professional web manager, and it's beautiful. It looks just like BU's website. Beautiful scrolling text. Look at the latest event, the most recent publication, the latest blog, updated yesterday. And Johan is getting about 100,000 visits a month. So again, up to you what you want to invest in, but my colleagues tell me that personal websites can have a phenomenal impact on disseminating your work if they're done well. You can also choose outputs that promote you. So one of the benefits of publishing with Elsevier journals, there are lots of costs. One of the benefits is that they will promote the top 25 hottest articles. And I was lucky enough to have a few featured, but these went out to about 30 million people. So choosing these types of journals can really help, and people watch these lists and tend to read what's in the top 25. And I also note and have noticed very big ticks in both downloads and citations after they list you on these things. Final thing you can do is join these different networks and mailing lists, whether it is the Sustainable Transitions Research Network or the Energy and Social Science Network, or there's SCORI, Sustainable Consumption and Production, or AESS, American Environmental and Social Sciences. There's ResearchGate, Mendeley, Academia, EDU, which apparently gives retirement advice, ORCID, and SSRN, that's the Social Science Research Network. I recommend you all join all of them. They're all free if you choose the basic parts. And they're a very good way of promoting your work. And it's strange. I still get unique requests to only one of these. So there are still people who only go to SSRN, or those who only go through ORCID, or those who only go to Academia EDU. No one goes to all of them. And so the downside is there's no single place people go. So it does make a lot of sense for you to join all of them and to upload your work. Another tip we have is to translate work that's academic into non-academic forms and outputs like press releases, policy briefs, blogs, or opinion editorials. These can help disseminate your work. I was lucky enough to have one in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago. You can also think about submitting stuff for departmental newsletters, or consortium newsletters like the Sussex Energy Group, or you can have book launches and media events and press roundtables, which take time to organize. You could even print stuff out and mail it to people, which I did once. Not sure how successful that was. And like I said earlier, use those email lists of colleagues who are organized by geography or topics. All of these will help take an academic output written in academic terminology, translate it into social impact. Okay, we're almost come to the end. So apart from, of course, thinking about novelty, rigor, and style, and being more proactive with how you promote your research when it's done, which can often be just as much work as the research, by the way. Good promotion also takes weeks to months of time. What tips do I have, actionable tips, for you all to become better researchers today? I have 5. So the first one, that's my mom, by the way, is don't underestimate your own value. I still remember my mom the day after I got my PhD, and I was an assistant professor. She said, "Ah, you sounded so much more exciting when you were a doctoral student." I was like, "What?" And there's some truth to that, right? Like when you become a scholar in the academy, you're no longer cutting edge. You're no longer in the lab. You're no longer seen at the kind of vanguard of research. It's less exciting. And there's some truth in that students are the future of research, and you are the ones who are reading the most up-to-date material. And I really like a quote from John Kenneth Galbraith, who was an economist, who said, economists are most economical of their ideas. Most make those they learned in grad school last a lifetime, which implies you stop learning once you get your degree because you're no longer curious, you no longer have to. So I think that means students have some of the best ideas. You can turn assignments into papers. So if you're writing something for your classes, especially grad students, put effort into it. Make it into an actual article that you could submit to a journal. You'll get better grades. You'll get certainly a better article. You'll get experience as you learn about publishing, and you'll have a chance to distinguish yourself and your department if you were actually successful. You can also take the time as a student to partner with professors, even those that aren't your supervisors or your advisors. And I'll give an example here of Will Rafey, who is at Harvard, wrote to me, he didn't even know me, in a very polite email, "Dear Benjamin, I have this idea for an article. Do you want to work on it?" Initially, I was like, no, but Will was very persistent, and he was very hardworking and did a very good large-scale content analysis of documents around the Medupi coal-fired power plant in South Africa, to the point where we did the article together. So it is possible for you, and it's totally legitimate for you to write to colleagues here, or professors at BU, and say, I've got an idea for this article. Can you work with me? Sometimes they will say yes. And to those like Debbie and other professors on the call, conversely, make every paper matter. Partner with students. Don't abuse them, right? Don't just put your name on their work. But I mean, really, transform a bachelor's thesis into an article, or a master's thesis into 2 articles, or a PhD into 4 or 5 articles, or maybe a book. And immediately transform working papers and conference papers that are sitting in your drawer or that you're waiting for into probably peer-reviewed articles. We all have the empty desk conundrum of things in the desk drawer that we should empty out. Or utilizing dormant original data that we never kind of got around to writing, and seek and cherish appointments that enable you to research. One of my own secrets of fecundity is that my first 3 jobs were only research jobs. I didn't have to teach, so I could dedicate myself to writing and researching, which I was passionate about. It's very, very hard to write a lot of articles if you're teaching 4 classes a term. Lesson 2 is you don't have to start with the full-length article. You don't always have to aim for the best journal and the 10,000-word masterpiece. You can try different types of journals, but you can also try different types of outputs. And I've gotten a lot of my students to really kind of get trained in writing by doing things like writing book reviews for science, or insight articles, or news and views, or short communications, or forums. These are easy to write. 1,000 words is about 4 paragraphs. And this gets them into the habit of writing. And I have a really talented colleague, Alex Gilbert, who was able to write in Nature Science, Nature Communication, Nature Energy, just by doing short communications. He was reading the journal every week, and he would see an article he liked, and he'd write a response to it. And journals actually usually like that, because it's like debate, engagement. So that was a little technique, and he learned the ropes, and then he learned who all the editors were of these top journals. And then you can also practice your writing with other forms of content. Like I said, newsletters, blogs, etc. You get into the habit of writing every week, different styles. It's almost like exercise. You'll build up skills and tolerance to become a better writer. Lesson 3 is also important, and that is be careful who you collaborate with. Be strategic. You can use BU as a resource, right? All top universities will have at least a dozen researchers in your area, really. Although they may not necessarily be in your specific college. You can consider, some people like to collaborate with people who are like them. I often like to collaborate with people who are dislike me because I want to find colleagues who don't have my perspective, or colleagues who are able to do methods that I am not able to do, like statistics or data analysis or model. I can't do that. So all of the work that I've done that uses those techniques, I'm partnering with people. So this is kind of like a team of rivals, right? Or it's finding colleagues to fill my own shortcomings and weaknesses as a researcher. That said, you definitely want to be selective. And I have some tips. Choose people who aren't assholes. Really, there are enough jerks out there, and life is too short to work with them. So if they're jerks or they're hard to get along with, they offend you, don't work with them. Make sure you choose people who meet deadlines. This is another real pet peeve of mine. Make sure you chose those who write well, who are rigorous, and who are ethical. And I often find, and I collaborate with people, if they violate any one of these, I will not collaborate with them again. And finding people who actually meet all 5 is more difficult than you may think. I'd say maybe 1 out of every 20 collaborations or collaborators that I pick. That said, when you do find people that meet these criteria, stick with them like glue. And that's why you'll see in my own publication trajectory, there are lots, probably a third of articles are written with colleagues that I keep going back to over and over again. Marilyn Brown, Steve Griffiths, Mary Martuscanian, Morgan Bazillion. These are colleagues that clearly meet these things. And I've written 20, 30, 40 articles with some of them. Done right, having 3 outstanding authors is a third the work for a paper. Done poorly, it's 3 times the work. This also means learning to say no. If you're overcommitted or overwhelmed, is also very important. Don't say yes to everything. Again, be strategic and selective. Lesson 4, I know I already said when I talked about style, but I think style is the most neglected of the 3 criteria for good research. I think everyone is trained pretty well, especially at BU, in rigor and research methods. And I think you're pushed in grad school on novelty, but writing well, it takes a lot of work. It takes just as much work, yet very few of us take classes in writing, creative writing, argumentation, or rhetoric, even though these disciplines literally teach you how to persuade. So I think that, yeah, take the time to write well. My colleague, Michael Dworkin, had a very formulaic way of writing. Every paragraph he wrote had 5 sentences. Thesis statement, 4 supporting sentences. Thesis statement, 4 supporting sentences. Now, it made for very stale writing, but it was very well structured. And he was able to publish in places like the Harvard Law Review. Get used to rewriting and editing and rewriting and editing. I've had some drafts that are on version 96, before they actually are sent into a journal or published. George Orwell, who you may know from 1984 and Animal Farm, also had a series of tips about good writing, which is just, be careful with your metaphors, be careful with trying to sound pretentious, be careful with making sure that you try to make yourself sound complicated. He has a great essay called The Politics of English Language, which gives good tips for how to write very, very well. My final tip, most controversial one, is good enough. Voltaire said, and I agree, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Do not wait for perfection. I always tell my students, submit it, not when it's perfect, submit it when you think it's good enough to pass reasonable peer review. And getting it into the peer review pipeline matters because sometimes it still takes years, plural. My longest record is 6 years from an article to be submitted all the way to published. Submitting early also means you can stake your claim. You have a submission date, so you can say, I had that idea in January, even though someone else maybe said it was their idea in March or April or the next year. And don't be afraid, right? In the worst case, you submit it and get feedback, but even if it's rejected, it's confidential. And like I told you, 82% of articles are rejected anyway. There's no shame in rejected. And in the best case, you get free feedback and you get published. And I really like this, which is what my dissertation advisor told me. You never actually finish a paper. You only abandon it at some point. You're ready to let go. So good writing sometimes is letting yourself get to that psychological moment where you're okay letting go. So with that said, and my tips about making every paper matter, about making sure that you write well, about making sure you use good methods and making sure that you are ethical and all that all aside, you also want to have a bit of fun. As Albert Einstein once said, if we knew what we were looking for, it wouldn't be called research. And let yourself be stupid. It is okay for you not to know everything. And even scholars like me will feel, I don't really understand this. And I'll ask colleagues, what does this mean? I'm not sure I get it. It's okay. I think, their stupidity has a very important role to play in learning, and there's also no shame if you allow yourself to be it. And with that, Debbie, here are 2 resources for you all. This is the article with Steve, John, and myself, and then we have another one published this year on peer review, if you want to learn how to handle it. Thank you for listening, and I'm now very much open to questions and comments. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's see if you want to, there you are. Great. Well, thank you for a really rich talk, and I'm inspired to go right now. And actually, if you're comfortable sharing your slides, we could save them as a PDF and disseminate to everybody who registered for our session today. So we're happy to take questions from our audience members. Feel free to either raise a cartoon hand, your physical hand, or a comment in the chat. So I see a new message here. Oh, there we go. Yes, so Kate Golden has a question. Is it wrong to present a research proposal poster, but you're not sure you're going through with it, to go through with it? And if Kate is here, if you're comfortable elaborating on that question, or Benjamin, do you feel you have enough to go with?
Sure, Kate, you want to tell me a bit more?
Sure, thank you. So I'm in my first semester of my master's in psychological science, and a paper for a class gave me an idea that could be applied to the lab I'm working in. But I'm just not sure, like it does, my advisor took a look at it and he said, it's not going to be anything groundbreaking, but it would be a worthwhile exercise just to, play with this data. But even if I'm not sure if I want to, commit a year and a half to, the whole process of doing a formal study, publishing and everything, is it still okay to present this research proposal?
Yeah, I mean, there's no ethical reason against it, and there's no like academic norm that you shouldn't do it. And many of us even present papers that we don't even publish all the time, because it could be we like the idea, and then people are like, this is a bad paper. What are you doing? So I think absolutely. I think that, in fact, it's the other way around. I would almost say, not only are you obligated to do it, it's a great way for you to get feedback, and it's part of becoming a scholar. And so just going to the conference, being exposed, answering questions is pretty good for you. So I would say that there's actually an imperative to do things like that.
Thanks. Yeah. And I figure, it's, even if it's not a perfect question, or even if the results won't be significant, it's still, it's a good learning experience. And having, like, I can learn from the criticism and then maybe develop a better question, or maybe get some inspiration from what people's feedback is. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's been highlighted. We all have papers that are small, medium, and large. And not anyone needs to be the magnum opus. It can be kind of a perfectly good smaller project. Great. Here we have let's see. Yep, you might get quick feedback too. So next we have a question from Lucia Villalonga. For the aspiring junior collaborators, how can we respectfully keep asking professors for collaborations if they have already refused? Like in your case with that Harvard student. And in general, what do you look for in a request for collaboration before deciding things like research question, preliminary results, CV? So really great question about interpersonal issues and bridging these new collaborations.
Yeah, absolutely. And the one with Will was exceptional, and there hasn't been another, although he was undergrad. I think with Will, I didn't ask for a CV at the time. First is the email. I get a lot of generic requests. Dear professor, I'm interested in writing a paper with your lab. Delete, right? Didn't even mention my name, the name of my lab, right? Or what topics and themes. So I guess it's like the nature of that first email and that request. And then usually if it's pretty well written or it's a good idea, and usually it has to have a good research question. So you can already tell, right? If it was that bad research question about extant democratic principles, I'd be like, no. But you can kind of tell. Then usually the 2 other things that I do is I arrange for a phone call or a Zoom for 10 or 20 minutes. And this is actually quite good too. I mean, Debbie may know, if we've hired a lot of people, doing pre-interviews can save a lot of time, because you'll learn in about 10 minutes with someone almost as much as you will in a 3-hour interview. So you just get a good sense for how they think. Are they articulate? what's their background, what are they after? And then with Will, what impressed me is I made him work for it. So I was like, I didn't say no initially. I said, well, Will, if you want me to do a paper with you, show me what you got. Show me your analysis and your method and your research design and what you want to do. And he did. He's like, well, I want to analyze these 600 documents, including these ones in different languages. And I was like, you're going to do that? All right, if you do that, I'm interested. And he did it. And he did it well with, pretty good frequency counts and pretty sophisticated content analysis. So it's kind of like he impressed me with his work. And in reverse, I challenged him to show me that. So I think if you do it that way, if someone says no, I wouldn't go back to them more than once. There are some, not many, there are some professors who say no to everyone expecting that you'll come back. And that's kind of their litmus test. It's like, well, the really persevering students will keep going and going and going. And there's all these films about that, right? Of like the big professor said no, but that student just kept asking and finally made it. So, I mean, I think you can try one more time if you've got good reasons with someone who said no. But after that, be respectful. But also, I think, show them you're able to do the work. A lot of times, I get requests for people, and it's all what I can do for them. Very rarely am I getting a request that's like, here's what I can do for your lab and for you. I'm willing to give you 10 years of analysis and data, et cetera, just for the opportunity to work with you. So it's kind of like a huge carrot for me, rather than another burden I have to shoulder along with everything else.
Great, thank you. And Lucia, did you have anything you'd like to add to your question? No, but thank you for asking. Oh, there you go. Wonderful. Thank you. Great. There you are. Okay. So next, Megan Lucy. So Megan, I know, is bold that she will speak. It looked like your research questions were structured to have yes or no answers. Are questions that are more exploratory still useful to create good research? And Megan can feel free to elaborate if she likes.
Hey, sorry. Firstly, thank you for this. It was super informative. But yeah, so a lot of my questions, for example, are sort of how questions, like how, if at all, like does the composition of, stakeholders at the municipal level, like right? Like where I noticed that like the bad, the better, and the good research questions that you asked on your slides were all like answerable with yes or no. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
So I don't think, so first of all, those three questions were chosen precisely because they illustrate those principles. And I was going for narrowness and falsifiability. Very rarely am I asking a yes or no question. So that's the first part. So I'm not practicing that. That's more just for educational, pedagogical purposes. However, I still think those questions don't really have yes or no answers, right? I think if a good scholar wouldn't just say yes, right? A good scholar would say, well, is Singapore practicing the precautionary principle for medical waste? There are degrees by which they do, and then you have a more nuanced analysis. That said, I think there are many open-ended exploratory research questions that are very good. And we've even used some of these recently with questions like, what are the injustices of electric vehicles? Or who has the most to lose from climate change policy? That's a very open-ended question. And then the answers come in, right? Low-income households or refugees or whatever it may be. So I think absolutely that, don't take my illustrative questions verbatim as how you have to do it. But I was just trying to underscore you want questions that are answerable, replicable, and falsifiable.
Fair. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. So other questions, either out loud or in the chat?
Megan, while we're waiting for other questions, one other thing that you can do, I didn't mention this, you can focus group your question. Same with your title and abstract. Like I said, these things are really, really important. And so that means that if you've got a research question, play around with it, have like 8 versions of the question and have like 10 of your colleagues sit around a table and then vote on which one they think is the best and get feedback and play around with different verbs, different ways of structuring it and all of that. And same with your titles and abstracts. When I'm uncertain about a title, I usually email 5 or 6 colleagues and ask, and unfortunately they often split 3-3 on a particular title, which doesn't help me. But I also, for titles, sometimes I'm too cheeky. Like I've got one called Revoking the License to Krill. Anyway, about overfishing in Antarctica. So I think, but there's like, don't have to do it alone when you have questions about research questions, ask others and get good feedback. That'll help too.
Great. So now we have another question about kind of worker dynamics, right? Research team dynamics from Alistair. So it says students, especially grads, write their paper with advisors, and often, especially toward the end of their degree, they might find themselves in disagreement with the advisor's opinion, from how to write sentences to which analyses to perform, even which figures to show or how to display them. How do you deal with these situations? I guess my question is, where does the relying on advisors' experience leave room for independence? It's a great question. And I would even add to that, if you get different kinds of advice from different members of your committee. So what say you?
Boy, there's no easy answer there. I mean, honestly, I often say this: you don't write your PhD for yourself. You don't write your PhD for the public. You write your PhD for your committee, because they're the ones who have to pass you. And that does mean you can get, I mean, I still remember, I won't say names, but I had a very large committee of 5. I know that some of those people even have 7 people on the committees. And I had one person who wrote very long sentences and another one who wrote very short sentences. And I laughed because it's like 2 days before I'm submitting it, and this long-winded advisor took my thesis and changed a bunch of sentences. And then 2 days later, my primary supervisor red-inked all of them, not knowing they were from them. So it's kind of like, I read your draft, Benjamin, and I'm very disappointed in these new additions. So it really shows you how much people can disagree. I like to see more independence. So I think it will depend on the supervisor. And like I said, if you're not willing to change supervisors, then you need to do mostly what supervisors are telling you, because they're the gatekeepers. And they're going to be your biggest allies, right? Even today, when I look at letters of recommendation for full professors, that first letter is still their advisor. That's expected, so that you're like kind of mated for life if you've chosen this advisor. But what I like to do, and we do a lot of PhDs by paper, so it's usually 3 is the minimum. So we say we want you to do 4. And so it's the first article is kind of me leading and just showing them. So that I'm writing the sentences, they're how I look, I'm choosing the diagrams, I get to set the tone for that first paper. Second and third papers are flipped, so the student leads, but we're still helping. We're still like, figure 3 needs redrawn, too much passive voice here. We need to rewrite this sentence. So we're still kind of playing an active hand in editing, but we're like second author, third author. But for that final paper, it is complete independence for the student. They rule, first author and only author. We're not writing anymore. Our comments are optional. I even say this to them, these are optional comments, and it's on them to handle the whole process. So there's a situation where I wouldn't, not only would I not counteract the student, I expect them to be able to craft sentences how they want. So they basically show me they're an independent scholar in their own right. And I like to see that progression of kind of, they're influenced by my style at the start, but by the time they're over, they have their own style. And I have students who are very creative. They put hip hop, artwork, songs, and poems into some of their actual research in very compelling ways. I had one do Dr. Seuss diagrams that actually worked well, and they got complimented in their defense, by the way. So I think, that's how I am. And I think if you do value that, just make sure that you have chosen the right supervisors who also will kind of nurture that and cherish that.
Great, thank you. So while we wait for more comments to come in the chat or hands to be raised, I'll ask a question for you. And I've been faculty for a long time, and so I see those places where either doctoral students or even assistant professors just have a hard time making their career go. And I think it happens in a couple of ways. Sometimes it's just the starting of the project, the writing of the paper, it's the starting. But for others, they can't get back up when they hit a road bump, whether they can't work their way out of a problem or rejection comes along. And so long way of saying motivation is such an important issue in this field. So what advice do you have for grad students who either just can't start the writing process or have a hard time bouncing back after some unfortunate encounter, whether with a peer reviewer, an advisor, etc.?
Very good question, Debbie. So I think publishing is so important in academia and in research. So I guess the first thing would be, if they are really struggling, they have to ask themselves if they belong. That said, there are lots of roles for scholars that aren't always so research centered. There can be outstanding teachers and instructors and lecturers who aren't very good at research, but are phenomenal at teaching. There's certainly a huge role for them at universities. Same with fundraising. I had a director who I won't name, who was antisocial, didn't teach at all, but he just had a way with grants. Like he could just write proposals and go to conferences and get the names, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and he wins them all. He had like 100% success rate. So again, we all have different skills, and they don't have to be so focused on writing articles. And I know some colleagues really still struggle to write, but are still very good academics and scholars, or activists, or spokespersons, or administrators, center directors. Most deans don't write because they're too busy administrating, right? So you could choose these different tracks that kind of get you out of the lab, out of writing papers. However, the other answer I have, and this is a sad answer, is that academia, unlike many other careers and spaces, is full of rejection. Like I said, 82% of papers are rejected. I get a rejection every week. And I cried the first few times I was rejected. It hurts, right? Even now, I still get upset. If I'm having dinner, I don't want to check email because there could be a rejection waiting there and it will ruin my dinner. So I think perseverance and having a thick skin. If you're the sort of person who's going to get upset every time you're rejected, then academic research is not the right place for you. It's just not. If it's going to upset your mental instability or it's going to create depression or anxiety, then, and I do know people that get very anxious about a paper, and if they're rejected, it's like 3 months and you don't hear from them. That's not good for them. So I guess it's also about the type of person that you are. And if you can thrive and handle it and benefit from it, or just at least not take it personally, and realize that we're all in this together. I mean, I've been rejected more than 2,000 times. And I'm not that old. 2,000 times. So, I mean, it's normal. It's completely normal, right? You may see the veneer of success on scholars like Debbie and myself, but, for every published article, there's 3 rejects. So just realize that it's totally normal. So I think for those that are struggling, Debbie, talking about it helps. So we used to have every Friday, the last month of every Friday was a social to talk about rejected articles. People would just come together and they would just complain and consume alcohol. You could also have workshops once a month, writing workshops where you read articles and share your articles and get comments and feedback to get more confident. And finally, for those that are really struggling at writing, they could be peer reviewers. So you go to the other side and get more experience looking at, because when you're peer reviewing, not only do you flip the power relation, so this means they're in control, you also see the other review reports. So you kind of get to learn what they think and how people write them and all that. So those would be some small tips for those that are kind of demotivated or that might need to get back up on their horse. I think the biggest, though, is letting them know it's normal. We are all in that. All of us are facing rejection, and there's nothing to be ashamed of.
Great advice. We are all in this together, and community is essential for productivity and keeping that spark going. So thank you all, and also sign up for our digest at CISS, and I'm sure Benjamin will put in a plug to sign in for the Digest of Institute for Global Sustainability. But we welcome your feedback on other topics you'd like to learn about, and we will reconvene at your request. So thank you so much for attending.